Welcome to Real Life Fiction Stories, and thank you for joining me. What a night, huh? The light making shadows dance around. Looks like something beyond mortality wanting to embrace me and pull me into its nothingness. Reminds me of a story. The story I'm told is true. It happened to a friend of a friend and began on a night not unlike this one not so long ago, and well, it just so happens to have been in this area not too far away. A story about a woman nearing the end of her life and losing her most precious treasure, her mind. A story that also begs the question, just where is that fine line between knowing what others don't and insanity?
"Sylvia!" A shrill, desperate voice echoed down the hallway. "Sylvia, they've taken my money again!" Sylvia Cruz had been a caregiver for nearly 25 years, and she was used to the odd rants and fits her clients were prone to suffer from. Nevertheless, she sighed with exasperation at Dolores Platt's frantic calls from her bedroom. "This old woman is driving me insane," she muttered to herself. "No one is taking your money, dear," Sylvia called back from the kitchen. "Remember, your daughter Stacy has your money. She's coming by tomorrow to give you some for the week. Just don't spend it all on those scratchers, and maybe you'll have some left over for the next time she visits." As Sylvia had been speaking, Dolores had made her way down the hallway to the kitchen and poked her head in. "Stacy!" Dolores choked out angrily and questioningly. "That no-good hussy spreading her legs all over town? She's in on it. Probably using my money to shack up with all those men in cheap motel rooms." "Dolores, that's not nice. Your daughter's been faithfully married for 35 years. The hussy," Dolores countered quietly to herself. Dolores was aware that at times her mind was not as sharp as she would have liked. Her hussy daughter made sure to remind her every time they saw each other, and to tell all of Dolores' friends behind her back that her poor mother had dementia. Her caregiver Sylvia had been with her for about 5 years now, since Dolores' husband had passed away. Sylvia would say that Dolores definitely suffered from more than just a mind becoming dull. She had seen Dolores argue with strangers, not recognize family, and have conversations with people who weren't even there. And each month that passed, it seemed to get worse. It had only been recently Sylvia began to stay overnight 5 days a week. Sylvia didn't mind. She lived with her adult daughter and used the extra income to go home to the Philippines for a month once a year. There was something else, however. Dolores had recently become violent. One night Sylvia had found Dolores digging into her arms with her fingernails, staring at the blood as it welled up from her skin. And when she had grabbed Dolores' arm to stop her, Dolores suddenly realized she was bleeding and began to fight Sylvia, thinking she had done it to her. Sylvia managed to wrestle away and calm her down with only a few bruises to show for her troubles. That and a well-landed wild punch to her face that left her with a black eye. If this continued, Dolores would need to be in a home soon. That night, Dolores awoke suddenly to a strange clawing sound at her closet door. She lay frozen and confused for a moment before becoming angry. This was it. She would catch those no-good thieves in the act. She slowly and quietly got out of bed, grabbing her cane from next to the nightstand to bludgeon the would-be thief. As she made her way across the floor, the sounds became silence, and in her heart, Dolores knew that they had heard her stir out of bed. She froze, holding her breath, trying as hard as she could to quiet the beating of her heart, which to her sounded like the pounding of a drummer in a marching band. After a moment, she heard it again. She slowly tiptoed to the door and cautiously reached for the knob. As her fingers wrapped around the cold metal, she suddenly noticed an odd smell coming from the closet, like something had died and was decaying behind the door. She did not stop to wonder why. Instead, she flung the closet door open and began to swing wildly. One of her swings managed to wrap a winter coat around her cane, knocking her off balance, and with all the grace of a sack of potatoes, she fell to the floor, taking what must have been a fair bit of clothing and multiple shoeboxes down on top of her as well because she couldn't move. Dolores began to call for help, and as she bellowed, she felt an icy hand make its way up from the mass on top of her and close around her throat, cutting her off mid-scream. There was more than clothes and shoes pinning her down. Dolores thrashed around with every bit of strength she had left, knocking even more things down in the process. Sylvia had heard the commotion from the room next door and rushed in to see what had happened. She found Dolores half buried in her lifetime's accumulation of clothing. She began throwing off coats and gowns and belts that had become wrapped around Dolores in her struggles, and with the final belt removed from around her neck, Dolores was finally able to sit up. and with a lucid clarity rarely seen in her as of late, Dolores stared with wide eyes directly into Sylvia's soul and whispered one word, sending shivers down Sylvia's spine. "Spirits." Sylvia knew it wasn't spirits in her closet, and Dolores was having another episode brought on by dementia, but that didn't change the conviction in her voice, and that is what bothered Sylvia. "Come on now, dear," she calmly reassured Dolores. "Let's get you up off of this cold floor." While helping Dolores up, Sylvia noticed a small hole in the wall by the floor and wondered if Dolores' late-night spring cleaning hadn't accidentally done it, or if the mice from the attic had been expanding their territory. She had called the exterminator in the morning just to be sure. Dolores had only slept a few hours before her body told her it was time to rise again at 8 a.m., the same time she had awoken each morning for the last 60 years of her life. She had no memory of what had happened last night, only a lingering suspicion that someone or something was out to get her. A paranoia that was buried so deep within her, she was unable to discern from where it sprang, only acknowledged that it was there. As she opened her closet door, she found everything in shambles. "Sylvia, they're trying to steal from me again! They broke into my closet!" Sylvia came into Dolores' bedroom. "No one is stealing from you, sweetheart. Remember last night? You heard a mouse in your closet and went to scare it away. You fell over and knocked everything down. I had to come in and help you up. I'll be calling an exterminator to look at it this week, okay?" Dolores stared at her for a moment and looked around confused. When she looked back up at Sylvia, her expression had changed into a snarl. "Don't think you can fool me," Dolores growled before moving past Sylvia, heading for the bathroom to finish her morning routine. The rest of the day went by without incident. In fact, Dolores had spent the entire day without saying anything further to Sylvia. She just sat in her chair by the window in silence, ignoring any attempts at communication, or, when prodded with questions, gave only a wave of her hand as if dismissing her court. And so it was until Dolores settled into bed to go to sleep. That evening, when Sylvia made her last check-in on Dolores before going to bed herself, she had found her sound asleep, snoring the night away. Sylvia walked over and made sure she was dressed properly for bed. No pantyhose or dinner gown. No, she was okay. Just her regular nightgown. Sylvia crossed the room to head for bed when she was suddenly aware of an odd smell coming from Dolores' closet, almost as if something had died in there. She had placed rat bait in the hole this morning, but didn't think they could die and rot that fast. Sylvia looked inside the closet but found the rat bait undisturbed. One of its brothers and sisters must have died some time ago, and the new hole now allowed the scent to waft out and fill the room. Sylvia closed the door and went to bed. She would deal with it in the morning. That evening, Dolores was awakened by the same smell she had encountered the night before, the smell of death and decay. She did not remember she had smelled it, but it was nevertheless somehow familiar to her. She opened her eyes and looked around the room and saw nothing. She was about to ignore it and fall asleep again, when out of her peripheral vision she noticed a shadow in the corner of her room. It wasn't a normal shadow. It was somehow darker, and even looked as though it was trying to hide itself among the normal shadows. She felt no fear, and somehow, as she peered into its black void, was filled with anger. "Are you the one stealing my money?" she asked accusingly of the entity in the corner, but was met with only silence. Before she could accuse the figure again, it had begun to move to her bedroom door. Dolores threw off the covers and grabbed her cane as she was suddenly compelled to follow it. Dolores found herself standing above Sylvia as she slept, the shadow in the corner watching over them both. As she stared at the woman's figure on the bed, she knew who had been stealing from her. She had no doubt. But now that she knew, what was she to do? As if driven by her thoughts, the shadow began to move once more, leading her to the living room, and paused briefly. Dolores looked around at all the pictures on the wall, the knickknacks on the shelves, her life on display in her home her and her husband had built together for so many years. She knew she could not let them take it from her. They had no right. This was her life, and all she had left, and she would be damned if any thief would lay claim to what was hers. The shadow again compelled her, this time to the kitchen. As she entered, the stove burners ignited on their own, and the back door to the garage opened. In perfect line of sight, as if deliberately placed, was a full can of gasoline reserved for the lawnmower. Once again, the shadow had revealed the true path to her. She opened the utility drawer and grabbed a barbecue lighter, and with a strength even she didn't know she had, Dolores had picked up the can and let it pour out slowly as she walked through the house. She made sure to pour extra at the foot of the evil woman's heap. Within seconds, the entire room was ablaze and Sylvia burning to death before she could even fully get out of bed and realize what was happening. When the police arrived, they found Dolores on the front lawn watching the flames lick up at the night sky and the smoke being swallowed up by the darkness. As she was being wheeled into the back of the ambulance, she turned her head one more time to look at the blaze that was once her home, and now the last resting place for Sylvia Cruz. The news report had touched on many details of the blaze, but neglected to mention the extent and implication of what was found in Sylvia's car. Jewelry, bank account information, copies of credit cards, and other random valuables that had been lifted by Mrs. Cruz that week. When police had investigated her home, they had found that over the years Sylvia Cruz had in fact been stealing from Dolores. What had once started as a few pieces of jewelry had escalated to bank account information and shoeboxes filled with cash, presumably the weekly allowance of Dolores Platt. No one would ever tell Dolores at her new home at Sunnyvale Mental Institute. But she knew. Dolores sat in her room staring out the barred window, no longer paranoid or afraid. She knew.